Dr. Alessandra Khalessi, welcome to Neurosurgery Tales. I was looking forward for this episode because of all your leadership roles, everything that you've done for neurosurgical community, and it's a really honor for me. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you for the invitation and your initiative in facilitating these conversations. I'm an admirer of the podcast and have seen some friendly faces come through. So I'm really glad to share, whatever perspective I have with you and your audience.
Thank you. Your journey is nothing short of extraordinary, balancing a thriving neurosurgical career and leadership role, groundbreaking research, and advancing neurosurgical education. What habits or philosophies have been most crucial in cultivating your intellectual growth and achieving such a broad spectrum of success?
Well, that's a really generous framing to my career. So I have to acknowledge, kind of, thank you for that. I think to kind of take a half step back, the way that I've actually thought about the ways that I could make an impact as an individual surgeon, as the leader of a department, or within our broader specialty is, really thinking about kind of lessons from history. Meaning, if you look at surgeons who began with kind of an ambition to leave the world better than they found it, what kind of first principles did they apply in their own lives? And so there's some necessary conditions, I think, to having an impact. And so that starts first and foremost with being an observer of disease and recognizing those neurologic conditions where there's a really unforgiving natural history or very poor competing standard, and then honing your technical craft to make sure that if you have the audacity to introduce a catheter into a blood vessel or to cut someone's brain or spine in the hopes of making them better, that your personal performance is not a variable in the completion of that task. And then that technical performance of a case is really just one small part of a much broader picture. And so very early on, I recognized that every person I encounter professionally is someone that I could actually learn something from. And so maintaining that curiosity and that approach of what value, habit, lesson could I extract from each member of the team, independent of kind of where they are in their experience or hierarchy, I think is really important in being in kind of on a journey of continuous improvement. And then lastly, I think it's really important to recognize that neurosurgery and the care of our patients is taking place in kind of a larger world. And so I think a lot of folks hide behind jargon, for lack of a better term, or create kind of a moat around neurosurgery and kind of believe that if they explain something in a highly technical or opaque way, then that means that they're an expert and somebody else isn't. And I learned very early on that if you can't explain something simply, that means you don't completely understand it. And so I held myself very early on to that kind of goal of making sure that if I believe something was important and needed to be resourced or invested in or taught or emphasized, then I should be able to communicate that clearly in a way that was kind of compelling to other people. And if they didn't understand it, that didn't mean that they were stupid. It meant that I actually hadn't done a very good job explaining it in the first place or didn't understand it completely myself.
And you mentioned that every person you meet, you learn something from them. And reflecting on your career, what is the most impactful piece of advice a mentor gave you?
Yeah, so I've been fortunate to have many outstanding mentors in my life. So, but I think there's like kind of a few pieces of advice that come to mind. The first is Marty Weiss, who was the chair at USC when I was accepted into residency. Had said to me when I first had the opportunity to join the RRC, he said, Alex, never mistake national prominence with local power. And I actually think that that's a very important piece of advice. I think because I think part of the reason I've been given this opportunity is because I've had an opportunity to serve in some of those national roles. But all of that actually draws from kind of being engaged in a day-to-day way in your local environment around the care of patients, support of your partners, and one is not a substitute for the other. And so you really actually need to be a surgeon first, and all the things that follow from that. And the reason that you have credibility in those other rooms is because you actually had the discipline to be a surgeon first. So I think that that's actually quite important. And then a second piece of advice was from Henry Brem, who was the chair of Hopkins when I was a medical student. And I think that there's this kind of constant emphasis on kind of work-life balance.
Hmm.
And by necessity, I see neurosurgery very much as kind of a calling as opposed to a profession. And so if it truly is a calling, then by necessity, you're going to be very invested of yourself personally, and you're not going to kind of see it as work. And so how do you actually make sure that you're meeting your responsibilities to your family? You're managing your own health, and you're doing all those other things. And so, um, recognizing that that's not a zero sum dynamic, and making your work in neurosurgery a family affair, I think is quite important, and has really, I think, been an enhancement to my relationship with my own wife and my children.
Hmm.
Because neurosurgery has given our entire family, I think, so much, and that's quite important. And then the last piece came from Nick Hopkins, who I did my endovascular training with, and Nick, he unfortunately and quite sadly passed away this past year. But Nick was this transformative thinker in endovascular neurosurgery, and what was really infectious about him is that he was always just so excited about what was possible, and he just had this like unwavering optimism that anything was possible. And I really learned from his example that way. And he was, I think, probably one of the very first people who demonstrated to me the power of kind of taking a skill set, experience, or technical approach from another discipline and applying it to a neurosurgical department,
Hmm.
neurosurgical problems. And so he was the guy who learned angiography from cardiologists, and said, and it became this kind of pay it forward relationship that he had years later with cardiology, which then when cardiologists became interested in ischemic stroke, it was Nick Hopkins who in turn, I think, made a lot of that initial work possible. And so, um, uh, not kind of standing on ceremony and believing that you could actually um, uh, not just learn from other fields, but then in turn kind of build stronger connective tissue with neurosurgery. That was, I think, a really important, informative lesson I learned from Nick.
That's awesome. And as a leader in neurosurgery and education, you've had the opportunity to magnify your impact through those you mentor and collaborated with. How do you approach empowering others, and what do you believe is the most important, meaningful way to create a long-lasting ripple effect in the field?
Yeah, so well, I think that those lessons, that's a great question, and I think it starts, when you're charged with kind of being a steward for a department, or trusted to be a mentor to others. Um, it begins with actually, in an intentional way, wanting to invest of yourself and give the energy to do that. So you have to actually believe kind of out of the gate, that mentoring others, and investing that energy is worthwhile and important. And I think I can say for myself personally, and for many of our faculty here at UC San Diego, that's a big part of the reason we're in academics and come to work every day, because those mentor-mentee relationships
Hmm.
create kind of a real synergy. Generations that are kind of maybe 15, 20 years behind the pipeline, like yourself, really push folks to kind of challenge their assumptions and their beliefs, or look at things, problems with fresh eyes, or and say, like, why do we do these things this way? And being kind of resistant to the idea of, like, well, because I said so, that should never be the answer. Again, you should always be able to actually explain a rationale for what you're doing, and tie it kind of quite transparently to principles. And if you don't have that clear answer, then that means you probably need to give some more thought to it. And so, um, I, and what comes by having those conversations is, A, you learn, even as kind of a senior established surgeon, but B, it instills in that person who's asking the question a real belief, from a very early stage, that they can make contributions to the team.
Hmm.
Uh, And there's two things that actually come from that investment. The first is I want, for example, the people who are in our department here to feel a real urgency and responsibility to advance the treatment of neurologic disease, because we believe, maybe 100 people get to practice in this kind of ecosystem of engineering, neurosciences, and clinical neurosurgery. So if you think about, our being a small guild-like profession of, let's say, just over 3,000 neurosurgeons in North America, you can't kind of wait around for somebody else to figure out a better way to do things. If you're going to be one of those 3,000 people, you better be contributing to advancing neurosurgical care tomorrow. So feeling that urgency and that ownership is important, because if you look at the kinds of things that I do today against kind of how neurosurgery was practiced 30 years ago, almost none of those things are the same.
Yeah.
And that didn't magically happen, and it didn't involve some kind of remote theoretical kind of large group of people. It was a small number of individuals who had sustained attention to detail and commitment to craft, and believed, hey, there's got to be a better way to do this, because every day I'm seeing living, breathing human beings who are suffering for lack of a better solution. And so if you are that frontline observer to neurologic disease, you really need to take that as kind of a challenge to kind of make things better. And then the last piece that comes with kind of that urgency and ownership is also being kind of a keen observer, and being able to kind of reduce things to kind of first principles and say, okay, well, this is how things are today. What are the constraints that make things as they are today? And what would need to be true in order for us to actually have a better way to treat this problem? And then that actually often, that kind of line of reasoning up will give you an opportunity to identify maybe a gap, and then and to push the field forward in a way that maybe someone else hadn't thought about doing before.
And as someone who held numerous leadership roles, how do you define the effective leadership in a field as complex as neurosurgery?
Yeah, well, I think again, I can tell you, my most recent societal leadership role was obviously
Yeah.
leading the Congress, and when you look at
Hmm.
kind of that executive committee, you're probably talking about 25 to 30 of the kind of the most talented people that I've ever met, and so how do you actually allow that organization, but more importantly, our specialty, kind of benefit from that collection of talent and effort and energy? And I think part of it comes with being kind of permissive. And what I mean by that is creating the space for each individual to declare, kind of in a self-assessing sort of way, what they believe their talents and strengths and interests are. And then saying,
Hmm.
like, these are the ways that I actually believe that I can contribute. And then crafting opportunities for people in general terms that, when kind of put together, create kind of a cohesive thematic whole. So you don't put a bunch of people in the same lane. You make it kind of very clear where the interfaces are and who has decision rights in a particular situation. And there's an art to putting that entire team together, but it's not something that you dictate. It's
Hmm.
something in kind of a very intentional way. You give folks an opportunity to express that interest, and then really listening to the answers. And if there's a component of what, quite naturally in any organization, there's going to be a component of what people are asked to do that maybe isn't their favorite thing to do, but is necessary work that actually needs to be done. And I think it's actually quite important to recognize that when people do that. And so if I said to you, hey, now kind of hearing what your interests are, the way you want to grow, the ways you want to contribute, these are the things we actually need you to do in the coming year. Maybe 85% of them, of what you're
Hmm.
being asked to do, is going to be kind of consistent and aligned with your own, values, personal and professional development goals. And maybe 15% is going to be kind of a service to the organization and the specialty, and may not be the thing that makes you the most excited in the world. But I'm going to recognize and celebrate and appreciate and remember that 15%.
Hmm.
And I've never had someone who's kind of not willing to kind of go on that journey with you when you have that conversation. And then the last piece is I think that sometimes people confuse being supportive with being kind of conflict avoidant. And what I mean by that is I've had many experiences in my life where someone who was senior to me would maybe not tell me yes, but also not tell me no.
Hmm.
Um, and so then I'd invest a lot of effort and energy trying to like make something happen where I now know from experience or with the benefit of hindsight, there was never ever real intent or support to make that happen. And so I actually also think, and this is actually probably the hardest part of kind of mentorship or leadership, is for lack of a better term to kind of own the no.
Hmm.
And some of the best things I've done for some of my fellow kind of volunteers or my faculty partners is to have the discipline to sometimes say, "Hey, we can't do that now, but this is what would need to happen in order for that to happen, for that kind of current no to become a yes." So then you're going on a shared journey with someone to say, like, we can agree on milestones, and if we hit these milestones and check boxes, this is in a structured way how you can go from a no to a yes. But in the absence of that structure, if I actually don't think something's a good idea or that person doesn't have the aptitude or talent to do that, it is my responsibility, as difficult as it may be for that person to hear, to say, like, look, I actually don't think that's a good idea, and there's not really a path to that. Do you know what I mean? And that
Yeah.
person may be super mad at me in the moment, but gosh, 6 months later, they'll come up to me and be like, "Hey, thanks. Like thanks for actually like because that wasted effort. As I said, if we really believe each individual has the ability to change the world, I'm not helping them if they're spending 6 months on something that I know isn't the right thing.
Hmm.
Um, so I think that's actually one of the hardest parts of leadership, and obviously I'm still working on it. But I think owning the no is actually a very important and under-recognized aspect of leadership.
That's actually making a favor to that person, not wasting their time and efforts on things that
Yeah, and
probably won't
respecting
make.
them enough to
Yeah.
actually be able to kind of handle the truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Look,
Uh,
I always kind of tell my peers, like, I'm a 5'9" person. Like, I'm not going to play in the NBA. Like, it's like, you just got to own that. Like, that's okay. Like, like
yeah.
even if I shoot 500 free throws a day, like, I'm not built like an NBA player. And that's, you gotta know yourself, and know what you're good at and what you're not.
And you've contributed to the development of neurosurgery milestone for the ACGME. What specific challenges did you encounter specifically when standardizing training in a field as diverse and complex as neurosurgery?
Yeah, so that was a great experience. Alan Friedman had actually initially speared that around kind of the milestones for just general neurosurgery, and then also in what at that time was called endovascular surgical neuroradiology for interventional. And I can tell you that policy well crafted and educational milestones or what have you
Hmm.
should be permissive and should set a floor and not a ceiling. And so the role of milestones in education are really to make sure that the trainee is going through that exercise of introspection or doing kind of meaningful self-assessments and can actually measure their progress in as objective and data-driven a way as possible. And that's based on kind of case experience and also based on kind of certain domains in which they need to achieve kind of competence. But kind of a score sheet
Hmm.
is not a curriculum. And I can tell you that organized neurosurgery has worked really hard to kind of develop the connective tissue in the curriculum to achieve those milestones. There is kind of a well-developed effort for years through the senior society to do that. And I think now there is actually much better alignment between the CNS, the AANS, the senior society, and the board and the RRC to make sure that those educational resources are available in total to
Hmm.
support trainees who then actually want to progress as surgeons through those milestones. Um, uh, Progressing through those milestones, though, to kind of competence or even level 5 milestones um, should not be confused with kind of mastery.
Oh,
One of the things that I tell our residents, fellows, and faculty partners all the time is this idea that there's a certain raw body of knowledge and comfort that needs to be developed in order to actually have the necessary kind of command of what happens in the operating room and the care of patients, that you can look another human being in the eye and say, like, I can get you, safely through this care journey. And there's not going to be someone who has a move that I don't have or will be considering a treatment option that we haven't considered here. And if I'm not the best person to manage your problem, I don't have an ego about it. I'll be really clear and involve other folks in that person's care. And the reason I actually think that that approach is important is because often when you leave the hospital after either an urgent case or a particularly complex case, in a real way, the only person who knows if you did a really good job or not is you.
yeah.
And to reflect on that and own that, and you either have to feel deeply secure that you've kind of put in the work to kind of go to sleep and not think about it, and know that you've given that person a good operation. But you also know deep down if you didn't do that. I can't imagine living my life or practicing neurosurgery if I actually hadn't done that work. Because to not do that work and then be able to sleep at night means, like, you almost have to have an indifference to human suffering that I can't actually relate to. And that's kind of the failure mode for me when I think about metrics like milestones, or even just looking at something like this kind of culture of, like, hey, I was a PGY2, now I'm a PGY4. So that must mean I'm, like, growing and progressing, like this idea of kind of
Hmm.
social promotion in residency training, because nothing magically happens from the day you graduate your residency until you become an attending. And so you really need to feel that urgency and ownership, that am I the best neurosurgeon I can personally be? And everyone
Hmm.
knows deep down if they're putting in that time, effort, and energy and giving of themselves in that high quality way or not.
That's very deep.
Well, it's just honest.
uh,
I tell people
yeah.
all the time, I can't I can't care more about the kind of doctor you become than you do.
Hmm.
And so, but that said, if someone's kind of honest, working hard, showing up every day, it is absolutely my responsibility as someone charged with their training to get them there.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
and push them and put them in a position to be successful. And so that's what we do.
Yeah. Absolutely. As the president of CNS, what has been the most significant challenge you faced in leading such a dynamic and influential organization?
Well, I think in general, it's really important when it's ultimately a short, I was on the CNS executive committee for a decade, but the presidency
Hmm.
itself is a year. Um, I, I think it's quite important um, uh, to have a lot of respect for the office and recognize that it's a stewardship role, and so to be thoughtful and intentional and consistent
Hmm.
about maintaining kind of the tradition and the history of the society. So you don't, you know, make any huge moves to disrupt those things, because if every president approached the job that way, it I think would lead to kind of instability. And so honoring the decisions you inherit, in my view, is actually quite important in kind of maintaining the best traditions of our specialty. And then the other piece that I think comes with that is recognizing that more so than other specialties, we have this kind of constellation of societies. You know, the Congress, the AANS, the Senior Society, the ACGME, and the board. Which we call kind of the summit societies. And now, I have a role on the Washington committee and chairing the Neurosurgery Advisory Council for the American College of Surgeons. So those are, additional features of kind of the broader neurosurgery ecosystem, and then our different subspecialty sections. And so I think the first part of being kind of an effective steward for our specialty in those roles is making decisions not necessarily in a kind of a narrow tribal way for the Congress, but thinking about the good of the specialty, and also making decisions with kind of the right time horizon in a way that's kind of tied to principles. And I'm quite proud when I look back at kind of the decisions that crossed my desk in the time that I was CNS president. You
Hmm.
always want to make decisions that you think will age well.
Yeah.
That 5 years from now, when I'm quite removed from the CNS and the CNS is trusted to others, that I could look back and say, like, yeah, I put the society in a little bit of better position than it was before. Or I still believe now, 5 years later, that decision was a good decision.
Hmm.
And so I think things, if you approach any role in terms of kind of doing what you think is right or doing what's best in the long term, that will by definition be good for that society. And so that was kind of how I approached it. I think the other thing, and this goes into the earlier question you asked about kind of relationships with mentees.
Hmm.
um, I I think that uh, I have found that uh, culture and history is often set in a relatively short period of time. And so, if you believe that the people who tell your story, as I did, in your first question about mentorship,
Hmm.
are the people who will come after you, um, you manage each of those interactions in a way that maybe has a little bit of a lighter touch, because these aren't people that you're superior to, that you know more than they do. That may be true in that moment as a function of your differential experience, but in 5 or 10 years, it won't be true.
Hmm.
In 20 years from now, if we're sitting here, I'll be hopefully retired, and, and very few people may remember or know my name, but you may be a prominent established neurosurgeon in her prime, and you'll say, like, Alex Khalessi, he was okay. And that will be kind of the lasting impact. And so if you approach those relationships at this stage in that, I would say, kind of a generous way, and with that view that the people who come after you, if you've done your job right, are going to be in a stronger position to move the field forward.
Hmm.
I think those relationships then have kind of a different quality and framing to them.
Yeah, that's absolutely inspiring. So, um, you emphasize also, I remember I saw a talk, personalized solution for your patients.
Mhm.
Can you share how do you approach tailoring treatments to achieve the best possible outcomes, specifically in vascular endovascular neurosurgery?
Yeah, so I think that one of the really special things about neurosurgery that makes it kind of different than any other area of medicine in my mind is it's a concentration of so much of what's the best about medicine. And what I mean by that is it's kind of so technical in kind of the performance of the interventions, but at the same time, you're really intervening on the substrate that makes people who they are.
Hmm.
And so the level of trust that's required, the fear on the part of patients who are dealing with something that's life-threatening or disabling, is are the kind of the moments that define their lives. And so that relationship and kind of the humanism that comes with that is really unique in medicine. And so what's required in having a personalized relationship with your patients is understanding your patients as people before they were patients,
Hmm.
and investing that time, effort, and energy. And that requires a certain vulnerability. And so it takes the discipline of kind of not getting too close in a way that then limits your ability to be effective for them as surgeons.
Yeah.
But actually understanding their larger life, their support system, being really practical about what their goals of care are. I think that is really important in kind of developing that treatment plan. And then also, I think having those really direct conversations about, hey, I commit to you in this first conversation, particularly if we're managing, let's say, a complex tumor where the natural history of that tumor is not particularly good, is saying, like, listen, you know, I understand that you're looking at an actuarial table and saying there's a strong possibility I'm in a situation I don't want to be in, 18
Hmm.
months, 2 years, 3 years from now. Um, but it's my responsibility to you as your doctor to kind of tell you when we're there.
Hmm.
And we're not there now. We have lots of moves. And so we would obviously all wish that we weren't in the situation we are now. But given this diagnosis, this is your next best step. And in the time where we actually have fewer steps, or there are things that I can't offer you in a data-driven way, then I'll tell you my best sense of, these are the strengths and weaknesses of each of these options, and we'll make that decision together. So it requires you, A, knowing the person, B, being really comfortable saying, this is what I know and don't know about, thousands of people who've been in a very similar situation. And then the last piece, which in my mind, particularly in the vascular space, is the most important, is not allowing patient preference to steer them away from what you know to be best. And what I mean by that is, if you take, for example, as someone who can kind of offer someone an interventional treatment or an open surgical treatment,
Hmm.
there are still times, particularly for young people, that to offer someone a durable cure and to protect them from meaningful complications, an open surgical approach is the best approach. Because there's much closer surveillance that's required. There's much longer need for medications, that have their own side effect profile in the intermediate or long term. And just having that frank conversation with a patient of say, like, look, we could treat this both ways. Um,
Hmm.
and I understand that nobody wants to have open surgery, but the reason open surgery is still done is because there are circumstances where that's quite clearly best to protect you from the things that most folks with this diagnosis actually care about. And so you're trading a short period of risk or discomfort for what I call the, hey, you never have to think about this again,
Hmm.
freedom that actually comes on the back end. And in general, I think that if you approach conversations that way, it really does allow you the opportunity to offer kind of a personalized care plan. And then the last thing is, it's always a relationship. And so I never try to achieve everything in one conversation. So, for
Oh.
example, I usually, even if patients really want to commit, like they say, like, I want the surgery yesterday, I say, no, I want you to go and reflect on what we said, and I want you to think about it. And then you can kind of reach out to my kind of team when you're ready. Because, I'm not, and nor as a surgeon should you ever be kind of a salesman. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
that's not the role, and so you can kind of, offer or recommend things, which are kind of different levels. But you're never selling. And I always encourage people to get as many opinions as they want.
Hmm.
And because I'm fortunate that there are always more patients who need a neurosurgeon than there are neurosurgeons. So there's not a shortage of stuff to do. And you just want to do things for the right reason in a way that, like I said, that you can kind of sleep well at night.
Yeah. And as someone who is widely admired by the neurosurgical community, what would you say is one of your own imperfections?
Oh, this was something that it does take a in kind of the earlier conversation we were having about trying to kind of craft an opportunity for someone, or to share with someone kind of a vision of like, hey, this is the journey we should go on together. Um, I am sometimes impatient when maybe someone is, in my view, acting in a way that's against their own interest.
Hmm.
So giving people the space to kind of absorb and understand and come to things in their own time, recognizing they're different people with different experiences. Um, I think I do a pretty good job of that, but I'm definitely not perfect. And so I think if you asked folks that I work with, what would they say is an imperfection of mine? I think that's a fair thing to say. That uh, I'm not. I don't have I'm quite disciplined about kind of making a decision and then moving to kind of the next thing. And so maybe the cycle time of revisiting decisions, I think
Hmm.
I think that's probably an opportunity for me to kind of to continue to improve. I also think that I I'm a very trusting person. uh I give everyone kind of the benefit of the doubt. um but I think once you've kind of lost my trust, I wouldn't say that like I'm the easiest person in the world for you to like get back on my calendar. Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
so it's not completely like a one strike and you're out, but it's definitely like I'm fortunate to have really amazing people in my life, and so I don't know that like I have a lot of room for people who maybe have breached my trust. Is
I'm
that
asking you
fair?
this.
Is that
Yeah,
a fair
yeah, it
is
is.
that a fair imperfection? I'm sure I have many others, but I think those are kind of two off the top of my head.
Yeah, I'm asking you this because during the CNS, you were on the stage and there was a neurosurgeon next to me. Unfortunately, I can't remember his name because we just met. And he told me that you're a neurosurgeon with emotional intelligence on steroids. So that's why I
Oh,
decided to ask you that. Yeah.
that's well, yeah, I think that's really generous.
Yeah.
Well, I think it goes back to the kind of very simple principle that I just think that I can learn from people.
Hmm.
And you can't learn if you're not paying attention.
Yeah.
And so I do try to really listen and respond. I think the other thing that comes with that, just that concept of emotional intelligence, is um, I never enter a conversation having prejudged the outcome.
Hmm.
So like because if you go in and I'm like kind of shocked how many people approach their lives this way. Like they'll have like a list of meetings and they're going, okay, I want to do this in this meeting, this and this meeting. But then that kind of like defeats the purpose of having the meeting. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Because if in your mind you've already actually kind of decided, then that's not really a meaningful exchange of information. And that's the fun part,
Yeah.
right? It's kind of like why they play the games, right?
And you're relatively young and you achieve so much. What inspires and drives your work every day?
Yeah, I think probably starting from the place of like I actually still like there's a lot more to do.
Hmm.
Like so for example, um I wouldn't consider being president of the CNS an achievement. Do you see what
Hmm.
I mean? Because that's just a position. The achievement is what do you do with the position? Do you see what I mean? In
Oh.
other words, do you create experiences for others that are memorable or that push them to be a little bit better. And so I think what keeps things fresh is, as long as you are in a position of responsibility, it is rejuvenating to think about, well, what's the best thing I can do today to meet that
Mm-hmm.
responsibility, to get a little bit better. And I will tell you that our uh, specialty was built by people who
Mm-hmm.
approached their lives in precisely that way. That it wasn't that their 5,000th aneurysm was any less absorbing than their 50th.
Mm-hmm.
Because for the patient you're operating on, that's the most important surgery that you'll ever do. And so recognizing that that's what makes what we do such a privilege and so special, I think is quite important. And the day that you don't feel that way is the day that you shouldn't be doing it. But there are no shortage of neurologic conditions that are beyond our reach. There are no
Mm-hmm.
shortages of challenges in terms of how healthcare is delivered today that neurosurgeons and local leaders can't inform that conversation and make things a little bit better. Um, there are, medical students, residents, and faculty partners that are in various stages of their own, professional development. So in some small way, being able to support them in that work has a lot of value. And I just still think that realizing a lot of what's kind of coming next, there's still this very wide gap between the structure of the brain and our subjective experience of the mind. And so I'm
Mm-hmm.
really excited to be living in a time where we've gone from these beautiful high resolution connectomic maps to this idea that we have now the material science and computational power and large scale algorithms to kind of decode the music of the brain in a way that's, I think, going to inform some fundamental questions of kind of what makes us us. And so to live in a time where we're kind of touching some of those answers, gosh, I mean, if that doesn't make you excited, then I don't know what you'd ever get excited about. And so I still think that being part of the solution to some of those problems
Mm-hmm.
is a real privilege. I'd lastly say that if I would say there's one thing that you'd guard against, surgeons tend to have this kind of disease of self-congratulation because you invest so much to get to the point where, hey, I can do that case skin to skin in an hour.
Mm-hmm.
You've given up so much in so many other areas of your life to do that. But kind of an aphorism we have around here is, pilots don't high five for kind of landing the plane. You know what I mean? You're the pilot. It's your job to land the plane. You're the surgeon. It's your
Yeah.
job to do the surgery. And so what we should really celebrate as a specialty is how are we kind of leaving the field better than we found it? And I think there's many areas where we can still have an impact, and that's the fun part.
And lastly, what single piece of advice would you give to medical students or those who are at early stage in their career who hope to make a meaningful impact in the field?
I actually think you can't be successful if you're not happy. And so the most important thing outside of kind of being clear-eyed about what your talents and abilities are is uh, asking the question of kind of what puts me in a better position to do this than somebody else. And what am I actually passionate about? Because if you're passionate about it, then it won't feel like work.
Mm-hmm.
And there'll be a joy and a quality to what you do that will be special and different. I have a faculty partner, Jeff Steinberg, who from very early in his career was fascinated with bypass. And so for some folks, being in a lab, kind of spending hours and hours on that craft of kind of suturing those anastomoses that would be seen as kind of a tedious task. For Jeff, it was a joy. And that came through in the way that he was able to actually develop that aspect of his practice. And so I think being introspective about those things will
Mm-hmm.
put you in the strongest position to have a real impact. And then the other thing is that there tends to be an excessive emphasis on what everybody else is doing. And I actually understand it, because the less experienced you are, the more you want to kind of reason by analogy or look at your peers at a similar time and say, hey, am I tracking as I'm supposed to? And the reality is that, success in general terms is kind of non-linear.
Mm-hmm.
And so the better question is not like, hey, what is, A, B, and C doing versus what I'm doing? The better question is, did I use today to be the best version of myself that I could? And seeking out the perspective of individuals who may be more experienced, who you trust, to say, like, how could I do better? And what could I do more? And if you're introspective that way, you'll be shocked how few people are kind of consistent enough to have a lot of
Mm-hmm.
good days. One of my friends, Philippe Albuquerque, showed a slide, and I really loved at the CNS, and the Giannata Symposium. It said, 1 to the 365th power is 1, whereas 1.01 to the 365th power is 37.7. And so if you do a little bit every day in a consistent way, you're going to end up in a totally different conversation than where you started.
Thank you so much. This has been a truly inspiring conversation. I'm so grateful for this opportunity. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. This was a lot of fun for me, and hopefully bring some value to your audience.